The snow in Bitter Creek, Montana, did not fall so much as it arrived deliberate and final, settling over the rooftops of the small railroad town like a judgment passed from a cold and indifferent sky. It lay thick on the platform of the Northern Pacific Depot, on the iron bench bolted to the wall, and on the single leather satchel that sat beside Nora Callahan like the last thing she owned in the world. Because it was. She was 24 years old, and she had arrived on the 4:15 from Billings with a letter of introduction in her coat pocket and the particular kind of hope that comes from having no other options. The letter was addressed to a Reverend Silas Holt, who had written to the teacher's placement office in Ohio 3 months prior, requesting an instructor for the new schoolhouse his congregation had built on the eastern edge of town. Nora had answered his letter the same afternoon it arrived. She had packed her books, said goodbye to her mother, and counted her savings to the last cent. She had not counted on the sign nailed to the church door, Reverend Holt gone to Billings, school suspended until spring. No explanation, no forwarding address. No one in the small knot of people near the general store who seemed to know anything useful or who cared to say so to a stranger holding a carpetbag in the snow. Nora stood on the church steps for a long moment. She read the sign twice, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something more reasonable. They did not. She turned and walked back to the depot platform, sat down on the iron bench, and placed her hands flat on her knees. She was a woman who had taught herself not to cry in public, not because she was cold, but because she had learned early that tears in front of strangers invited the wrong kind of attention and the wrong kind of help. She looked out at the main street of Bitter Creek, a hardware store, a saloon with a broken shutter, a land office with a lamp burning in the window despite the early hour. The mountains behind the town were enormous and white and utterly silent. She reached into her coat pocket, not for the useless letter, but for the small folded piece of paper where she had written her finances in her precise schoolteacher's hand. Enough for 4 nights at the boarding house, she calculated. If the rate was reasonable, after that, nothing. She pressed the paper back into her pocket and said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "Well, that's that." Across the platform, leaning against the depot wall with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low against the wind, Emmett Cross heard her. He had been waiting on a land survey parcel that was supposed to arrive on the same train, a set of updated boundary maps for the Hargrove Telegraph Station, where he served as chief operator and the closest thing to a postmaster Bitter Creek had ever produced. He was 36 years old, lean and weathered in the way that men who spent their winters alone in high-altitude stations tended to get not hardened exactly, but pared down, stripped of everything that wasn't essential. He had noticed the young woman on the platform when the train came in. He had a habit, born of years of reading incoming wire messages, of observing details without appearing to. He had seen the determination in the way she carried herself off the train, the careful set of her shoulders. He had watched her walk to the church with the confidence of someone who had a plan. He had watched her come back without it. He had heard the way she said that's that, not with despair, but with the particular exhausted flatness of a person who has used up all their alternatives and is now taking stock of what is left. He was not a man who involved himself in other people's problems. The telegraph station suited him precisely because it sat 3 miles outside of town, because the work demanded concentration and solitude, and because the only conversations it required were the ones that came in over the wire. He had spent 11 years building a life defined by its useful quiet. He pushed himself off the wall. He told himself he was going to check on the survey parcel at the freight window. He walked past the freight window entirely, crossed the platform, and stopped in front of her. She looked up. Her eyes were the color of pine needles in winter, very dark green, very direct. She did not look frightened or helpless. She looked like a woman doing arithmetic. "Pardon me," he said. His voice had the low, careful quality of a man who chose his words the way a surgeon chose his instruments, not many, but precise. "I overheard you. I wasn't trying to." She studied him for a moment with the calm, assessing gaze of someone who had learned that an apology was not the same thing as trustworthiness. "And the station where I work," he said. It handles freight manifests, incoming wire traffic, land grant correspondence. 3 counties worth of paperwork. It's been managed, more or less, by me alone since my assistant left in August. He paused. I say, more or less, because the less is the part that's getting worse. The Territorial Land Office in Helena has been sending complaints. She waited. The position pays $18 a month, he said. Room and board at the station. The work is clerical mostly. Records, correspondence, filing. If you have any facility with numbers. I have a teaching certificate from the Ohio Normal School, she said. Mathematics and literature, both. I managed the school district's budget for 2 years before I left. He nodded once, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. The room isn't much. It's warm and it's clean. She stood up. She picked up her satchel. She looked at him the way she had looked at the sign on the church door, clearly, without flinching. I'll want to see the terms in writing, she said. Something shifted slightly in his expression. It was not quite a smile. That's fair, he said. The Hargrove telegraph station sat on a bench of flat land at the base of a granite ridge, surrounded by lodgepole pines so tall they seemed to be holding up the sky. The main building was made of squared timber and river stone, low and solid, built to withstand the kind of winters that Bitter Creek only experienced at the edges of. There was a small outbuilding for equipment storage, a woodshed stacked high with split pine, and a corral holding 2 horses and a mule that regarded Nora with the profound indifference of animals that had seen everything. Inside, the main room was exactly what she had expected from a man who lived alone with a telegraph key and a set of land maps. It was functional and completely without comfort. Every surface held paper. Not chaotically, there was a system. She could see that immediately, but the system had clearly been designed by someone who understood the information and had no interest in making it accessible to anyone else. Emmett showed her the small room off the back corridor. A narrow bed, a pine dresser, a window that faced east toward the mountains. The glass was clean. There was a quilt on the bed that had clearly been made by someone who was not him. My mother sent it, he said, noticing her look. Last Christmas. It's a good room, she said. She did not rest. She set her satchel on the dresser, changed out of her traveling clothes, and came back into the main room. She stood in the center of it and turned slowly, taking it in. May I? She asked, gesturing at the nearest stack of correspondence. He had been watching her from the doorway to the operations room, where the telegraph key sat on its own dedicated table. He nodded. By the time Emmett returned from his evening round of the equipment, Nora had cleared the main table entirely, sorted the correspondence into 6 distinct categories, and created a paper ledger page borrowed from a blank form she had found in the bottom of a supply drawer that listed each category, its volume, and its apparent urgency. She had also found, stuffed beneath a stack of freight invoices, 4 unanswered letters from the Helena Land Office, 2 of which contained final notices. She set the ledger page on the cleared table with the 4 letters placed on top of it in order of their postmark dates. He stood at the table for a long time. He picked up the letters. He set them down. He looked at the ledger page with the careful attention of a man reading a map of territory he had not known was charted. I'll answer them in the morning, he said. I already drafted the responses, Nora said from the kitchen, where she was doing something with the iron stove that was producing a smell entirely unlike the beans and hardtack that had been his standard provision. They're on the right side of the table. You'll need to review them and sign, but the information is accurate. I used the file numbers from the freight manifests. He picked up the drafted letters. He read them slowly. They were concise, correct, and written in a hand so clear it might have been typeset. The tone was professional without being cold, apologetic without being servile. They were, simply, good letters. He set them down and went to stand in the kitchen doorway. She was standing at the stove, her back to him, her dark hair pinned up under a practical knot, stirring something in the cast-iron pot with the focused attention she seemed to give everything. Where did you learn to write correspondence like that? He asked. My father was a county clerk, she said without turning around. I wrote his letters from the time I was 12. She paused. He died when I was 17. Someone had to. He went back to the table. He read the letters again. They settled into a pattern within a week, the way two competent people sometimes do when they are placed in a shared working environment without the interference of sentiment. He managed the telegraph operations, the equipment maintenance, the physical demands of the station. She managed everything else. The correspondence, the filing system, the freight manifests, the supply inventory. And once she had asked his permission and he had given it without hesitation the station's financial accounts, what she found in the accounts was not criminal, but it was close. The station had been operating under a provisioning contract with a supply company in Billings that charged freight rates 2.5 times higher than the standard. The previous assistant had apparently signed the contract without reading it. The contract renewed automatically every 6 months. It had been renewing for 3 years. She brought it to Emmett on a Tuesday evening, spreading the contract and her calculations across the cleared operations table. "We can break it," she said. "There's a clause on page 4, see here, that allows termination with 30 days' notice if the station can demonstrate a comparable supply source within the same territory." I found one. She put a second paper beside the contract. Haddock's Freight, out of Miles City. Their base rate is lower, and if we consolidate the quarterly orders into 2 annual shipments, we save enough to hire a second assistant by next winter. Emmett looked at the contract. He looked at the numbers. He looked at the Haddock's Freight information. He had been the chief operator of the Hargrove station for 7 years. He had handled thousands of messages, managed the equipment through 3 catastrophic winters, negotiated every freight delivery himself. He had not once read the provisioning contract past the first page. He felt something shift in his chest, a pressure he recognized, after a moment, as something between shame and relief. The shame was straightforward. The relief was more complicated. "Write the notice," he said. She wrote it that evening. He signed it without changing a word. The ranch hands who supplied the station with firewood and occasional labor started noticing things around the 3rd week. The lamp in the main room burned later. The response time on freight acknowledgments dropped from 4 days to the same afternoon. The station began to feel less like a relay point and more like a place where things were tended. The changes between Emmett and Nora were quieter. A pair of leather gloves left on the kitchen table before the first hard freeze, without a note. The telescope from the equipment room, cleaned and placed on the east windowsill of her room, positioned precisely for the angle of the mountain she had mentioned looking at. Strong coffee waiting at the operations table every morning, at the hour she had never told him she started work. He had simply noticed. She noticed, in return, that he rubbed his right hand when the cold got deep into it, an old injury, she gathered, from the set of the scar along his knuckles. She began keeping the iron warming box on the operations table during the coldest hours of the morning. She said nothing about it. Neither did he. The station hands saw how it was. Men who work in isolated conditions develop a fine sensitivity to the emotional weather around them. They found reasons to deliver the wood and leave quickly. They stopped lingering over coffee. It was a surveyor named Aldous Vane who disrupted it. He arrived on a clear morning in late November, riding a very good horse and wearing a very expensive coat, and he asked for the station's chief operator by name. He had the easy manner of a man who had never been told no by anyone he respected, and he shook Emmett's hand with the warmth of a man who needed something. Nora was in the records room when he arrived. She heard his name from the operations room, and she stood very still with a freight manifest in her hands. Aldous Vane. She knew that name. She knew it the way you know the name of a fire that burned down something you loved. 2 years prior, in the county where she had taught school, a man named Aldous Vane had come through as a representative of the Meridian Land and Survey Company. He had presented the school board with a contract for updated land surveys of the district surveys that, as it turned out, were designed to redefine the boundaries of 3 parcels in ways that transferred water rights to a private irrigation concern in which Vane himself held a significant interest. The contract had been signed by 3 board members who either did not read it or did not understand what they were reading. The school where Nora taught had been built on one of those parcels. When the water rights transferred, the well went with them. By spring, the school was closed. She set the freight manifest down and walked to the doorway. Vane was laying documents on the operations table with the practiced ease of a man who had done this many times. He was explaining, smoothly and at length, the opportunity he was presenting. The Meridian Company was expanding its survey network into the Northern Territories. The Hargrove station sat at a critical junction point. They wanted to establish a secondary relay office, a small thing, he said, a desk and a wire line within the station. In exchange, the station would receive a generous annual stipend and a formal endorsement from the Meridian Company, which would, he implied, carry considerable weight with the Territorial Land Office in Helena. Emmett was listening with the neutral attention he gave all incoming information. His expression revealed nothing, which was one of the things about him that Nora had come to understand meant he was thinking carefully. "The contract is straightforward," Vane said, sliding the document across the table. "Review it at your leisure. I can return Friday for your signature." Emmett looked at the contract. Then he looked up, and he saw Nora standing in the doorway. She was very still. Her expression was controlled, but he had worked beside her for 6 weeks, and he had learned the language of her stillness. This was not the stillness of someone who had nothing to say. This was the stillness of someone who was choosing, very carefully, how much to say and to whom. He picked up the contract. "I'll need a few days to review it," he told Vane. Vane's smile didn't waver. "Of course. Take all the time you need." After he left, Emmett set the contract on the table and waited. Nora came into the room. She sat across from him. She placed her hands flat on the table, a gesture he recognized as her way of grounding herself when she needed to speak carefully. "I know that man," she said. She told him everything. She told him about the school board, about the water rights, about the surveys that meant one thing on their face and another thing entirely, if you read the boundary descriptions against the county land records. She told him how she had figured it out only after it was too late, how she had presented her findings to the board chairman and been thanked politely and ignored completely. She told him that the school had closed, that 14 children had spent the winter without instruction, and that Aldous Vane had moved on to the next county without consequence. She spoke without heat. She laid out the facts the way she laid out the account ledgers, precisely, in order, with the documentation to support each point. When she finished, Emmett was quiet for a long time. Nora watched him. She had put everything on the table, her history, her word, her judgment against a signed contract that offered the station real and tangible benefits. She was asking him to trust her reading of a situation over his own practical interest. She understood what that cost. She had asked it before, in a different room, from people who had smiled and nodded and done exactly what they intended to do regardless. She had a sudden, unwelcome thought. She could be wrong. Not about what Vane had done before, but about what he was doing now. Perhaps this contract was different. Perhaps the offer was genuine. She turned the thought over honestly, the way she turned over a column of numbers that didn't balance. She looked at it from every angle she could construct. Then she met Emmett's eyes and said, "I could be reading this wrong. I want to be honest with you about that, but I don't think I am." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he picked up the Meridian contract and turned to page 3. He read for a long time, slowly, the way he had learned from watching her read, not for the main clauses, but for the definitions, the appendices, the language tucked into the footnotes like a burr in a horse's coat. On page 7, in the section governing the secondary relay office's operational scope, there was a clause granting the Meridian Company right of first refusal on any land transfer within a half-mile radius of the station for a period of 20 years. The Hargrove station sat on a land grant that was up for renewal with the territorial government in 18 months. Emmett set the contract down. He looked at it for another moment. Then he looked up at Nora, and there was something in his expression that she had not seen there before, not the guarded neutrality of the operations room, but something quieter and more open, something that understood. "You weren't wrong," he said. When Aldous Vane returned on Friday, Emmett met him at the door. Nora stood at the operations table, not hiding, not receding into the background. "I've reviewed the contract," Emmett said. His voice was exactly as it always was, low, measured, without drama. "The station won't be moving forward with this arrangement." Vane's smile tightened. His eyes moved to Nora, and she watched the recognition cross his face, slow, then sudden, like ice giving way. He would not have been able to place her immediately. She had been one schoolteacher in a rural district, and men like Vane moved quickly through the territories. But the recognition came, and with it, a flash of something that was not quite anger, not quite unease, but lived in the narrow space between them. "I see," he said. "The Hargrove station appreciates the time you took to present your proposal," Emmett said. It was a dismissal precise enough to be final and courteous enough to offer Vane no foothold for a grievance. Vane buttoned his coat. He did not look at Nora again. He went out to his horse and was gone before the sound of his hooves faded into the timber. The station was very quiet after he left. Nora began gathering the papers from the table, returning them to their proper files, the motion automatic, her hands steadier than she expected. She had not realized until just now how tightly she had been holding herself together all week. Emmett came to stand near the window. He looked out at the ridge, at the snow that was beginning to fall again, in slow, unhurried flakes. "I've been here 7 years, he said, not turning around. "I built the filing system. I know every manifest, every land parcel, every freight route in 3 counties. He paused. "I didn't see it. The clause. I wouldn't have looked for it." "You would have eventually," she said. "Maybe." He turned from the window. The fading afternoon light made the room feel smaller, closer. But not before Friday. He was quiet for a moment. "You protected this station. You should know that I understand what it cost you to say what you said, and that I'm glad you said it." Nora set down the papers she was holding. She looked at him directly, the way she always did, without softening or deflecting. "You tore up a good-looking contract on the word of a woman you've known 6 weeks, she said. "You should know that I understand what that cost you." Something shifted in his face, subtle, but she was watching for it. The careful neutrality gave way to something that was, simply, him. A man who had spent years paring himself down to the essential, and who was now standing in the middle of his own life wondering what he had left out. "I've been thinking," he said, and then stopped. He was not a man practiced in this particular kind of speech. She could see him searching for the right instrument. "I've been thinking," he began again, "about what this station is, what it's been." He looked around the room at the cleared table, the organized files, the lamp burning at the right hour. "It used to just be a relay point. You sent information through it, and it came out the other side. That was all it was." He looked back at her. "It's not that anymore," he said, "and I don't want it to go back to being that. I don't want any of it to go back." He ran his hand along the edge of the operations table, a nervous gesture, she realized, which was something she had never seen from him before. "What I am trying to say, and doing poorly, is that I would like to know if you're staying. Not because the station needs you to stay, because I need you to stay, as more than an assistant." The room was very quiet. Snow fell past the window. Nora was still for a moment. She thought about Ohio, about the closed school, about the church door with the sign. She thought about a woman who had arrived at a depot platform with a satchel and a plan that had come apart in her hands. She thought about gloves left on a kitchen table and a telescope positioned at exactly the right angle for the mountain she loved. She thought about the fact that she had almost said nothing about Vane, that she had sat with the knowledge for 3 days, turning it over, arguing with herself, terrified of being the woman who cried wolf and ruined everything she had built. That, she had told him anyway. "I'm staying," she said. And then, because she was a woman who believed in precision, yes, more than an assistant. The wedding was held on a Saturday in late February, in the main room of the station, because the snow made the road to town impassable, and because neither of them had wanted a large occasion in the first place. The circuit judge came out on horseback, bundled to his eyebrows. The two station hands and the woodcutter stood as witnesses, their expressions carrying the particular satisfaction of men who had seen something coming for a long time. Nora wore her blue wool dress and the garnet earrings that had been her grandmother's. Emmett wore his good shirt, which she had quietly mended the week before, reinforcing the seams without mentioning it. He had noticed anyway. The ceremony was brief and plain-spoken. When it was done, the judge shook their hands and took a piece of the dried apple cake that Nora had made the day before, and declared it the finest thing he had eaten in the territories that winter. 2 years later, the Hargrove Station had become something the Territorial Land Office in Helena cited in their annual report as a model of regional administrative efficiency. The Meridian Land and Survey Company had dissolved following an investigation by the territorial inspector, an investigation that had been initiated, in part, by a detailed written complaint filed with careful documentation by the chief operator of the Hargrove Station and his wife. Emmett had been offered a supervisory position in Helena. He had declined. He had, instead, negotiated a formal expansion of the station's charter, establishing it as an official land record depository for the Northern District, a position that came with a salary increase and a full-time clerical budget. On the evening the expanded charter arrived by wire, Nora was sitting at the operations table reviewing the year-end accounts. She had a cup of coffee at her elbow, already cold because she kept forgetting to drink it. Their daughter, 6 months old and possessed of her father's steady gaze and her mother's uncommonly loud opinions about the world, was asleep in the back room. Emmett came in from the equipment room and set a fresh cup of coffee beside the cold one. She looked up. "The accounts balance," she said. "We're ahead of projection by 11%. "I know," he said. "I checked this morning." She looked at him. "You checked my numbers." "I check your numbers every month," he said. "They always balance." She leaned back in her chair and looked at him with the expression he had come to love most. Clear-eyed, slightly amused, entirely certain. "Then why do you check them?" He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He picked up the cold coffee and turned the cup in his hands. "Because," he said, "when I read them, it doesn't feel like an accounting report." She waited. "It feels like the station," he said. "It feels like everything we built. I just like to read it." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she reached across the table and placed her hand over his warm against the cold cup, steady as the ridge outside the window. She had arrived in Bitter Creek with a satchel and a broken plan and 4 nights' worth of savings. She had not been rescued. She had been recognized by a man who knew the difference between a person who was lost and a person who had simply been set down in the wrong place, and who understood that the only useful thing to do was to show her the door. She had walked through it herself. That had always been the point. Outside, the Montana night was enormous and cold and blazing with stars, and the telegraph key on the operations table sat quiet in the lamplight, waiting for the next message to come in, the way good instruments always wait, ready, patient, needed. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't asking for help, it's being willing to be seen. Nora didn't wait to be rescued. She showed up, rolled up her sleeves, and let her work speak before her heart did. And Emmett didn't fall in love with her need, he fell in love with her clarity. When you bring your whole, honest self to the right place, you don't just find a home, you build one. A small note for you. This story was imagined and written by AI, crafted to bring you a quiet moment of entertainment and leave behind a little warmth worth carrying into your day.